Imagine this. It's Thursday, October 4th, 1582. You're tired. You blow out the candle. You say a quick prayer, and you go to sleep expecting tomorrow to be Friday, October 5th. But when you wake up, the world insists it's Friday, October 15th. No dream, no prank, no apocalypse. 10 days are simply gone. Not postponed, not delayed, deleted from the calendar. I mean, I've had times where I've forgotten what day it was, but this is a bit different. And if you'd like to zone out and forget other things about your life for a bit, check out my channel, as it's full of historical goodness for your viewing pleasure. Now, if this deleting 10 days thing sounds impossible, it's because we're used to thinking the calendar is the same thing as time. It isn't. Time is the sun and the seasons, or that thing Scott Bakula travels through to leap into other people. But the calendar is the human attempt to keep a neat set of boxes lined up under a messy universe. And in 1582, the people in charge of those boxes decided they needed to shove the whole grid forward by 10 days, fast, before it drifted even farther out of alignment. You can almost hear the questions people would have asked. If 10 days disappear, do I lose 10 days of my life? Does a baby born on the 10th now have no birthday? What happens to the saint's day on the 7th? Does that saint just get skipped this year? And the most practical question of all, if rent is due on the 1st, do I suddenly owe less or more? Those questions sound funny, but they point to something serious. Calendars don't just organize time, they organize society. To understand why anyone would dare to edit time, you have to go back to an older calendar and a small error that took centuries to become a crisis. For more than 1,500 years, much of Europe followed the Julian calendar, the one Julius Caesar introduced in 45 BC. It was a brilliant simplification. Most years were 365 days, and every 4 years you added a leap day, making the average year 365.25 days long.
The problem is that Earth doesn't take 365.25 days to go around the Sun. It takes about 365.2422 days. That difference, roughly 11 minutes a year, sounds harmless. It isn't. 11 minutes per year becomes hours, then days, then a slow but relentless slide between the calendar and the sky. Over time, the calendar gains about 1 extra day roughly every 128 years. At first, nobody notices. Then, a few centuries later, scholars notice. And another few centuries later, everyone notices, because the official dates stop matching the seasons in ways that matter. The date of the spring equinox, the moment when day and night are roughly equal, crept earlier and earlier on the calendar. By the 1500s, the equinox that was supposed to land around March 21st had drifted about 10 days away from where church tradition placed it. For most people, maybe that's just trivia. The seasons still happened. The harvest still came. You can live with a drifting calendar if all you need is roughly spring. But the church did not want roughly. Because one of Christianity's most important dates, Easter, depends on a relationship between the calendar and the heavens. The rule, developed in the early church and associated with the Council of Nicaea, tied Easter to the spring equinox and the full moon. Easter would be celebrated on the Sunday after the first ecclesiastical full moon occurring on or after the vernal equinox, treated in the Western system as March 21st. So the calendar wasn't just counting days, it was anchoring sacred time to cosmic time. And by the 1500s, the anchor was slipping. That's why this whole story becomes bigger than a nerdy math fix. If you can't agree on when Easter should be, you can't agree on the rhythm of the Christian year. And if you can't agree on the rhythm, you start raising questions about authority, about who gets to decide what the right date even means. So what do you do when your calendar is wrong?
One option is to shrug and let the dates drift forever. Another is to fix it. But fixing it means admitting that the date on the page is not a natural law. It's a human convention, and conventions can be changed. That's where Pope Gregory XIII enters the story. In 1582, Gregory issued a formal reform, often associated with the papal bull Inter Gravissimas, built on the work of scholars and mathematicians. The physician and astronomer Luigi Lilio is frequently credited with the core proposal, and the Jesuit mathematician Christopher Clavius became one of its major defenders and explainers. The reform had two parts: a dramatic one-time jump and a quieter rule change meant to prevent the problem from returning. First, the jump. To put the equinox back where church tradition wanted it, around March 21st, the reform advanced the date by 10 days. In places that adopted the change immediately, Thursday, October 4th, 1582, was followed by Friday, October 15th, 1582. 1 day passed. 10 calendar dates vanished. The goal wasn't to steal time, it was to realign the labels. Why October? Because pragmatically, it was a month with relatively few major religious observances to disrupt. In some places, October 4th was even associated with the feast of St. Francis, meaning people celebrated one feast day and then jumped straight into a new calendar world. The first adopters were Catholic powers: Spain, Portugal, the Italian states under papal influence, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with others following in their own time. Even France, though Catholic, made the switch a little later that same year, in December, which is a nice reminder that 1582 is a headline, not a single synchronized moment. Now, here's the part that sounds like it should cause chaos. If you delete 10 days, do people lose 10 days of wages? Do tenants get 10 free days before rent is due? Do loans suddenly skip interest? Governments and institutions had to make practical decisions. The guiding principle, where it was spelled out later in other adoptions, was basically nobody should gain or lose simply because the calendar got patched. If a contract was 30 days, you still owed 30 natural days. If a market day tracked the agricultural season, it had to stay aligned with the season, not with a now inaccurate page in a ledger. But if the reform stopped there, if it only deleted 10 days, it would have been a temporary fix. The drift would start again the moment the calendar resumed its old rhythm. So Gregory's reform also changed the leap year rule. This is the second, quieter part, and it's the reason you and I still live by this calendar today. Under the old Julian system, every year divisible by 4 was a leap year. That makes 100 leap years every 400 years. Too many. The Gregorian system keeps the every 4 years rule, but adds an exception: century years, years ending in 00, are not leap years unless they are divisible by 400. So 1600 is a leap year, 1700 is not, 1800 is not, 1900 is not, 2000 is, and 2100 will not be. That tiny tweak removes 3 leap days every 400 years, pulling the calendar's average year length much closer to Earth's orbit and slowing the drift to a crawl.
not perfect forever, but good enough that it takes thousands of years to become a major problem again. In other words, the reform didn't just delete days. It redesigned the machinery so the calendar would stop losing the race against the sun. If this were purely a scientific upgrade, you might expect the whole continent to say, "Makes sense," and adopt it immediately. That's not what happened. The Gregorian calendar was introduced by a pope. In Catholic countries, that carried weight. In Protestant regions, it could carry suspicion, sometimes outright hostility. Accepting the new calendar could feel, to some, like accepting papal influence. And the timing matters. Europe in the late 1500s is still deep in the aftershocks of the Reformation. This is an era when the wrong religious signal isn't just a theological disagreement, it's a political statement. So adoption fractured. Some countries jumped quickly, others delayed for decades. Some held out for centuries. You could, in theory, cross a border and arrive in a place where the date, officially, was different, even though the sun in the sky was the same. Imagine a merchant with a wagon of cloth traveling from one city to another. His ledger says he'll arrive on the 20th. The next town insists it's the 10th. A shipment is late in one calendar and early in another. Courts have to decide which date counts. Churches announce feast days that don't line up with neighboring churches. Even when everyone understands what's happening, it creates friction. And friction is expensive. Over time, practical life pushed the issue as much as religious authority did. Trade, navigation, diplomacy, printing, science. Everything runs smoother when you share the same clock on the wall and the same date at the top of the page. And this is where the story of the missing days evolves into something even bigger, a slow-motion standardization of reality. Now, because 1582 is the famous origin point, people often assume the drama happened all at once, everywhere. But some of the most memorable public controversy is tied to later adopters. In Britain and its colonies, the major shift came in 1752. By then, the Julian calendar was 11 days behind the Gregorian. Britain passed the Calendar New Style Act, and the country jumped from Wednesday, September 2nd, 1752, to Thursday, September 14th, 1752. And yes, this is also when Britain moved the official start of the civil year to January 1st, instead of the older practice that treated March 25th as New Year's Day in many records. In other words, Britain didn't just change the calendar, it changed the meaning of "the year begins." That British change has a quirky afterlife even today. Details like quarter days and accounting periods had to be shifted, and the legacy helps explain why parts of the UK fiscal year don't neatly align with January 1st. Now, this is where the legendary protest line is said to appear. "Give us our 11 days!" It's a perfect slogan, punchy, righteous, and easy to remember. But the famous image of crowds erupting in outrage because the government stole their days is probably more legend than documented fact. There was real confusion, real complaining, and a lot of satire in print culture. And satire has a habit of becoming history once it's repeated often enough. Over time, that catchy line and a few satirical images were retold as literal street riots, even though clear contemporary records of mass riots are hard to pin down. And that right there is the real lesson of the missing days. When we talk about the Gregorian reform, people love the spooky part, the vanishing dates, the feeling of a hole punched in history. But the deeper story is about how humans negotiate reality. We measure the year with calendars and clocks, but the year doesn't care about our neat divisions. Earth's orbit isn't a tidy fraction. The seasons don't arrive because we named a month. The universe doesn't wait for our paperwork. So societies build systems, conventions, that are good enough. And then, once in a while, the system drifts far enough that good enough becomes a problem. The fix is never purely technical. It's always social. You can invent the smartest calendar on Earth, but it only matters if millions of people agree to live by it. If courts, churches, merchants, and farmers will trust it, if governments will enforce it, if neighbors will use it. That's why the story of the 10 missing days isn't just a quirky historical anecdote. It's a case study in how reality gets standardized. So the next time you hear someone say, "Time is running out," remember, sometimes time doesn't run out. Sometimes people in power just take out an eraser and rewrite the date.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this one, hit the like and subscribe buttons. And if you comment with rage, be sure to write in all caps. Don't make me guess your emotional state. You're better than that. Anyway, we release shit like this every week, so yada yada yada. Okay, I have to go feed my cat. Bye.